Okay, y'all, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Welcome, welcome, and thank you for joining. With photo shoots being canceled all around, I really wanted to do something to help everybody who may be missing out on a photo shoot or just want to learn how to get better at photography, whether it be to document your family, your life, whether it be to create images for your business. Right now, a lot of people are like, I'm going to get my online business going. So I really wanted to create a class that could assist with that. I've always used photography as a wellness tool to document milestones in my own life so that I could look back on them and just remember how far I've come, remember those moments. And I've just always felt that there's a special connection with photographs. And I'm hoping I can pass some tips and insights to you to help you accomplish whatever your photo goals may be right now. The tips I'll be going over in this class can be used with any camera, but as the saying goes, the best camera is the one you have on you. Since most of us carry around camera phones, I specifically included tips for iPhone users because that's the phone I have. But again, these tips can be used with any camera. So whether you have a DSLR, point and shoot, a camera phone that's not an iPhone, you should be able to apply the lessons here so you can get started in creating professional looking photos with whatever camera you have. So, sorry. A little bit about me. My name is Tiara Mitchell, and I am the owner of Tiara Mitchell Photography, so that you know where I'll be pulling my knowledge from. I have been a professional portrait photographer for the last 6 years and a lifetime hobbyist photographer. I believe that photography is the only way to make time stand still. And so I'm pretty obsessed with capturing moments involving my children. I was inspired to open my photography business when I was pregnant with my first daughter, and I got to experience then just firsthand how important it was to have these memories and to have them documented in the way that I was envisioning so that when I looked back on them, they had that sentimental feel I really wanted. When you're feeling nostalgic. Over time, that passion grew into me specializing in motherhood photography, which I believe is how I create images specifically that mothers will love, whether it be of their children or of themselves. So, what we'll be covering in the whole series, I've broken it down into 3 parts because I want to make sure we can get time to practice the concepts because they will build upon each other. So, in today's lesson, we're going to talk about optimal iPhone settings, your capture controls while you're capturing, whether you're on your iPhone or your camera,
Huh?
and composition.
Okay.
Oh, I got to mute. Let's mute this. There we go. Sorry about that. Lesson learned. Okay, so thanks for joining, Misha. So that's what we're going to learn in part 1. In part 2, we'll be going over lighting techniques and simple setups. So once you know how you're going to get your strong shot, then I want to tell you how to make it even stronger. Photography is really all about your light and your composition. Those 2 things really will make or break your photo. And then part 3, editing, is where kind of the magic happens because that's when you get to let your vision come to life. And then, of course, sharing. So let's get right into setting up your camera. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the best camera is the one you have on you. But remember, your camera is only as good as the photographer. In other words, when it comes to creating professional looking images, it's more about knowing how to use what you have than having the right gear. So moving to using your iPhone, I own Apple 11 Max Pro, and I honestly feel like they did a great job with this camera, but there are a few tweaks you can do to really get the most of shooting with your iPhone. You first want to turn off live photo. Live photo is where when you take a picture, it captures like 3 seconds of the frame is that if there's movement, and then it chooses one in between. This can cause like some really wonky things to happen. So just to avoid all of that, you turn it off. Go directly to your camera. Up in the right hand corner, there's like this circle that looks like a bullseye target with dots around it. Tap it and it should cross it out and turn it off. You also want to use Smart HDR. HDR stands for high dynamic range. And what it does is it takes a photo, it takes the highlights and the shadows and makes sure the highlights aren't overblown, and makes sure the shadows aren't too dark, and it makes sure your midtones, the ones in between, are also really well exposed. We'll get into exposure a bit later. And it takes all three of these and combines them into one image to where you have really balanced tones. So to make sure you have your Smart HDR turned on, you want to go to Settings, go to the Camera menu in your settings, and turn on Smart HDR. And then finally, while you're already in your settings, you want to turn on your grid. Your grid will help so much with rule of thirds, which we will also talk about in this lesson, but it'll also help make sure that your horizon line is straight if you need that, or just lining things up in general. So once you have those turned on, will be good to go with your phone. And as far as if you're shooting on another phone or on a camera, I really encourage you to look over your manual. Most cameras have the grid. Most cameras have the option to use HDR, although there's a better way to use it, which is a more advanced technique. And I doubt there's any cameras like, DSLRs that use live photo. But still, always read your manual because it will tell you how to set up your camera to have the most control so that you can make sure you have really solid images. All right. So the two things, like I mentioned earlier, earlier I said composition and lighting really make or break your photo. And the two things that can ruin a photo faster than anything are having them be out of focus or having them be exposed improperly. So when your image is in focus, the subject is sharp. That means all around everything else could be blurry or whatever, but your subject is tack sharp. When you're shooting on your iPhone, there's something called focus tapping. And what that is, you take your camera, you position it on your subject, and it will try to autofocus, so a little yellow square will come up. But if you tap that yellow square, or you tap the subject, the yellow square will appear on your subject, and you'll see how it starts to focus on just that. If you want to lock your focus on that, you can tap and hold. And when you tap and hold, you'll see it kind of click down on it, and I believe it says AEF comes up on it. And what that means is now the phone knows you are locked on that subject for your focus. So if you move your phone around, it will stay in focus. Another good trick on the iPhone is the exposure control option. That's when you take your finger and you slide it up to make it brighter, or you slide it down to make it darker. Sometimes, because the phone comes with auto exposure, so sometimes the exposure doesn't quite look the way you want it to look. And the key to any well-edited image is to have a well-exposed image and also an image that's in focus, because there's no way to fix blurry photos in Photoshop. Yes, you can sharpen them, but you can't fix a blurry photo. A blurry photo is a blurry photo. You can fix exposure in Photoshop, but if your highlights are too blown out, there's no coming back because the data is not there. And if your shadows are too dark, again, the data is not there, so it's not really going to help. It's best to get these things done in camera the first time. All right. So now we're going to go into composition. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I leave this, when it comes to the iPhone, two things to keep in mind. You do not want to use digital zoom. That's when you take your finger and you pinch and pull to either get closer or further. Either step back to get a further image if you want a wider shot, step back or step closer. Zooming in digitally, unless you're using their really cool feature that they have now where they have the 1 and the 2 and the 0.5, but that's for another day. The whole point being, If you use the digital zoom, it'll ruin your photos. It'll ruin the resolution, and then it's just not going to be a good photo anymore. Step forward or step back. All right, now on to shot composition. Composition is really important because our brains subconsciously work to read an image as fast as possible. The better composed your image, the more pleasing it is to the eye, and the more effective the story of the image will be. So, for example, when you read a book, you read from left to right. Same thing with your brain. Same thing with looking at an image with your brain. Your brain reads the image from left to right. So, if you have a picture of a girl in the mountains and she's on the far left part of the frame, your brain's automatically going to register, oh, this is about the girl before it registers the mountains. But if the girl is right in the middle of the frame, all you're really going to focus on is the girl. You're not really going to care about the mountains. But then if the girl is on the far right of the frame, your brain's going to see the mountains and think, oh, here are the mountains. And oh, look, there's a girl looking at them. So it kind of works like that. There are 4 main points of composition to keep in mind: perspective, vantage point, and rule of thirds, and negative space. Sorry, that equals 4. So with perspective, you've probably heard a lot, it's all about the angles. So even small changes in your angles can totally change the way an image looks. So if you look at this shoot of this baby girl, she was taken in the same light, same setup, didn't change anything about the image except where I rotated, how I shot on her, just to give variety in the looks. And if you're shooting with babies, you always want to get variety and move quickly because they move quickly. So you have 4 main things to think about when it comes to your perspective, your angles. You want your high angle, that's the bird's eye view. That's the one of the first one of the baby. You want your low angles. That's when you shoot from below your subject up to them. Makes them look bigger, more superior. You don't want to do this angle if you're working with somebody who's like maybe a little weight conscious, because it makes them look bigger. And if you want them to look slimmer, then you go back to the high angle because it makes them look smaller. The next angle is first person point of view. So that's when you do a direct shot, like just how you're looking at the person, your subject. You shoot from there. And then there's lateral movement. So when you move from left to right around your subject to get different angles, or you rotate your subject around left and right to look at you. So with the last image of the baby, she's looking kind of over her shoulder at me just to get a different look. Okay, so this is just a little review: low angles, high angles, lateral movement, first person point of view. When you're shooting, especially if you're new to photography, you want to try to get as many angles as you can, like to experiment with, so you can find out what your favorite ones are, or just so you can find out how you like to use those angles to accomplish the look you're going for. Okay. Next part of composition is vantage point, the point of focus created by organic or geometrical leading lines. Now, leading lines are the lines that point to your subject. And I have 4 examples here. The first 2 are organic lines. So organic lines are pretty much anything you can find in nature: trees, water, the sky, even the way you have contrasting colors and highlights and shadows. So for example, this first image of the mama in red, I used the path to point to her. So even from behind and in front, it directs to her. And then I use the separation of the orange leaves and the green leaves to put her right in the middle. So even with everything else going on, she's still the center of the image because of her vantage point. If you move on to the couple under the trees, the branches and the fence lead to the couple. You see how the branches point down, the fence looks like it's coming down, and they meet right there. And then, so those are organic lines, and then we have geometric lines. Geometric lines are lines that you find in architecture, like streets. They're usually man-made. So, image of a little boy playing with his trucks. We lined them up so they could specifically create a geometrical line. He didn't really want to line up the way I wanted him to, but hey, it's there. But you can even see in the background how there's that tree and the wall there, how where they intersect, the little boy is right there, like his elbow's right there. All these things come together to kind of tell your brain, hey, this is the focus I want you to have. And then this last image is a really great example how I used this walkway to point to the couple. So your eyes automatically go right up to them. Okay. Rule of thirds. This is my favorite thing about composition. Rule of thirds is when you separate a frame into 9 parts. They have 3 columns and 3 rows. You use those lines as a guide to lead viewers' eyes through the photo. So this is why your grid is a big deal, because it'll help you understand what the rule of thirds looks like in camera before you shoot. I'm gonna do my best to explain it with these images. And these are all from the same shoot, and that's why I hope they'll help. So with the one of baby and dad, if you were to create the 3 columns and 3 rows, the baby is all the way off to the right side of the image, and as well as dad. But if you were to be able to see the lines, you would see that where the other lines come to create the rows, they're intersecting right at those lines. So when it comes to the rule of thirds, you either want your subject to be directly inside of those rows and columns or right at the intersection of them. And in this example, it's at the intersection. If we go up to the baby at the top, she is off all the way off to the right, and she's occupying the last 2 columns of the grid, and she's also occupying all 3 rows. And I like to shoot like this just to add interest. We'll go into negative space in a second, but I love using negative space to make it more about the subject. And that's what I did here using the rule of thirds. And then down there with her brothers holding her, the first, that's a row of the grid, is empty, all negative space. The bottom 2 rows are completely occupied, but each column of the bottom of it is occupied by either the brother or the baby. Kind of giving your brain an idea of what this image is about. Okay. And let's go on to negative space. Negative space enhances a photo. And there's also something called dead space, which is really similar to negative space, but dead space takes away from the photo. It doesn't add anything to the photo. It can actually be more of a distraction. So for example, in all of these images, I've used negative space to kind of bring interest or impact directly to the subject. So with any of these, I could have cropped really tightly on the subject just to make it about them. But when there's negative space, it kind of just adds like a feel of, I like to say, like larger than life. It's like an impact kind of thing to the image. And the black and white one is a really good example of how you can easily use dead space instead of negative space. So for example, the couch in the background really doesn't tell you anything about the photo. She's actually at a bar, so it doesn't do anything for the story. Neither does that black line going up there by her head. It's kind of just in the way, but this whole white space right there and how it directly ties to her face. This was for a lipstick ad. It gives all the blacks come together to make you go right to her face because the white is where her face is on top of. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. Some tips about making sure you are using negative space and not adding dead space is if you're in your background, try to use them as plain as possible. It's really easy to do on backdrops or just walls, empty walls. And if you do have something like if you're out in the woods, one of the pictures of the couple in the tree, the couples under the tree where I showed the branches as leading lines. If you're outside, you can make sure that the background is really far away from your subject so that it doesn't become a distraction. And that's how you can make sure it's more negative space, which is adding to your photo, and not dead space, which is just like, what's going on here? Okay. And so just a quick tip about perspective, now that we've gone through all of the points of perspective, is you want to use perspective to create depth in your images. So in all of these, I shifted my angle, I shifted my vantage point, I used leading lines, all to really make you understand what these photos are about. So starting with the maternity photo, I use that tree right there. It comes directly from the top onto her. There's this blurry part in the beginning by her feet, kind of tells you she's far away, because if it's blurry, then that means she and her in focus. That means the depth of field is deeper. Depth of field is a more technical term that you can look up if you like, or I can provide extra info if you want. And then also the wedding couple, if you want to add depth of field real quick, easiest way is to just get down low and use the lines to go to your subject. With the grad down here, I used the trees and how tall they are, and I made her seem like smaller than them to show just how vast the trees are. And then the baby with his family behind him shows how far away he is from them. So anytime you're creating depth, you're just working to show how far away your subject really is from you. Okay, so that's really it when it comes to composition and getting your camera set up. The main things you want to remember is to always check your settings before you shoot. Make sure you're set for your focus. So some cameras have autofocus, some have manual focus, and you have different ways you can adjust your camera to adjust your focus. Same with exposure control. You can either put your camera into a specific setting, or you can put your camera into manual. So you can have an auto setting or you can have manual. I actually really like both. It just is all about knowing the effect you're going for and how you're going to achieve it. Keep your subject in focus, because you cannot correct a blurry photo in Photoshop. Don't let anybody tell you different. Use proper exposure. While you can adjust exposure in post-processing, you can't save highlights and you can't bring up shadows to where it looks realistic. So it's just always best to get that as close to perfect in camera as possible. You always want to compose intentionally. So you want to use your leading lines. You want to use, I'm just stuttering now. You just want to use all the points to make sure that your composition is strong. You want your viewer to be able to look at the photo and know what's going on. You don't want them to get confused or distracted by anything. It's kind of like the saying goes, how when you are watching a movie, everything that the director chose to show you, they chose to show you for a reason, because it tells the story of the movie. It tells the plot. Same thing with the photo. Everything you include in a photo is there for a reason. And then practice, practice, practice. You're not going to become a great photographer overnight, but you will become better day by day with each photo you take. And then share your work for critique. That's how I learned a lot. I got my feelings hurt a whole lot of times. I still get my feelings hurt, but it's always for the better, because you grow from it. So what I would like us to do to prepare for the next lesson, where we will talk about lighting setups, the type of light, finding and manipulating light, and easy setups for portraits and lay flats. To prepare for this class, I would like for you to pull your cameras out and take some photos. Practice the things we talked about for composition. Make sure you have your exposure on point. Make sure your focus is on point. Submit the photos. You can either message me, put them in the comments for the video, and I'll pick some to go over so that you can be ready for the next lesson, where we will talk about using light to really make your images more impactful and kind of posing your subjects and setting up lay flats. All right, that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you for those of you who were able to come live. Thank you for those of y'all that will watch later. Please let me know what you think. I look forward to doing more of these. Take care and bye-bye.